Edith Piaf sang on Paris streets before anyone knew her name. One person heard her there. Years later, far from Paris, they heard her again and understood for the first time what they had been standing in front of. This is not a story with a large cast of characters. It is not a story about a famous night or a famous stage or a famous concert that left behind photographs and reviews and the testimony of hundreds of witnesses. It is a story about a street corner, a voice, a person who stopped walking, and the long, indirect route by which that moment found its meaning. The meaning did not arrive quickly. It arrived after years, after distance, after the particular accumulation of experience that makes certain memories suddenly visible in a way they were not before. To understand why this moment found its meaning when it did, and not earlier, you have to understand what the Paris streets of the late 1930s sounded like, and what it meant, in that particular world, to be a voice on them. Paris in the late 1930s was a city in the specific state of a place that senses, somewhere below the level of daily life, that what it knows is ending. The preparations for what was coming were already visible in certain ways, in the conversations that stopped when someone entered a room, in the newspapers that people read carefully and then folded without commenting, in the particular quality of the city's pleasures, which had taken on the slightly heightened quality that pleasures take when people understand, at some level, that they may not be available much longer. The cafes were full, the streets were loud. The music continued as it always had, from windows and doorways and the small stages of clubs that opened every evening regardless of what the morning papers said. Among the many voices that moved through those streets in those years was one that had not yet attached itself to any name that a stranger would recognize. She had been singing in the streets of Paris since childhood, not as entertainment, not as performance in any formal sense, but as the work her life had given her, the means by which she ate and moved through the city. She had progressed from the courtyards and passages of Belleville and Pigalle to occasional appearances in the small clubs of the same neighborhoods, and in those years the transition was still in process. She was not yet the thing she would become, and the street was still part of her world in a way that the stage had not yet fully replaced. A person was walking through one of those neighborhoods on an ordinary afternoon, not looking for anything, not expecting anything, moving through the city in the way that people move through cities when they are occupied with their own business, and the streets are simply the medium through which that business is conducted. They were passing a doorway or a passage when the sound reached them. What they heard was not what they expected to hear. This is the part of the account that is hardest to describe without either over-explaining it or leaving it so vague that it loses the quality that made it worth describing at all. The voice was not extraordinary in the way that voices are described as extraordinary in the breathless language of music journalism. It was extraordinary in a more specific and more difficult sense. It was the kind of voice that seemed, when you first heard it, to be speaking about something you already knew but had never been able to say. Not the words were whatever they were, a chanson of the period, a song that was or was not known to the person walking by. The words were almost beside the point. What was not beside the point was the particular quality of the voice itself, which had in it something that stopped people. The person stopped. They stood in the street or just inside the passage and listened for the length of a song, possibly two, The accounts of the moments we reconstruct always have this approximation about them. The duration becomes uncertain when the attention is fully taken up by what is being heard rather than by the tracking of time. They listened, and then they moved on, because there was somewhere they were going, and the city continued around them, and a voice on a street corner, however it made you feel, was not a thing you rearranged your afternoon around in those years. They did not know the name. There was no name to know, or rather, there was a name, but it had not yet been attached to anything that would have made it recognizable to a stranger passing through a neighborhood they did not live in. The voice remained a voice, connected to an afternoon, connected to a street corner in a neighborhood, connected to a city that was, though none of them knew it yet, already beginning to change into something none of them would have chosen. What followed, for this person, was the series of things that followed for many people who were in Paris in those years, and were then no longer in Paris. The war came. The particular life that had made that afternoon possible, the wandering through neighborhoods, the unscheduled stopping for street music, the general availability of ordinary time, became unavailable. People moved. They went where they could go, crossed the distances that the circumstances of those years opened between people and the places they had been. An ocean, in many cases, was not the largest of those distances. The memory of the voice traveled with them the way small, inexplicable things travel through the upheaval of a life being reorganized around new necessities. Not prominently, not consciously kept, not returned to in any deliberate way. It was simply there, the way all memories are simply there until something calls them forward. Paris itself, in the years after the war, became the kind of city that people who had left it carried in a specific, aching way, not as a place they could easily return to, but as a version of the world they had known, before the version of the world they now lived in. And the gap between those two versions was wide enough that the crossing was not simple in either direction. The street corner where the voice had been was still there, presumably, in the geography of a city that had survived what it had survived. But the afternoon was gone, and the afternoon was what mattered. By the time the radio was part of this person's daily life, they were somewhere that was not Paris. America, or some version of the world that the war and its aftermath had produced. Different furniture, different weather, different language on the street outside. The particular dislocation of a life rebuilt in a register that did not quite match the original. The radio was the thing that carried music across the distance, that brought into the rooms of wherever you now were the sounds that connected the present to some prior version of the world. It was not nostalgia exactly, though nostalgia was part of it. It was the daily maintenance of a self that was made in some important part of sounds that no longer surrounded you. On a particular day, on the radio, a voice began. It is not possible to reconstruct this moment with the kind of precision that the person who experienced it probably felt in retrospect. The moment that becomes, in the telling, the dividing line between before and after. What can be said is that something happened in the room when that voice came through the radio speaker, and that what happened was not the ordinary response to music, even very good music. What happened was recognition. Not immediate recognition of a name or a face or a category. Something prior to that, the body's recognition, which arrives before the mind's and which manifests not as a thought but as a physical sensation. a kind of stillness that descends on a person who has heard something before, but cannot in the first seconds place where. The mind catches up later. First, the body knows. The voice on the radio was the voice from the street corner. The person understood this before they could have explained it, and the explanation came a few seconds later in the ordinary way explanations come, through the name the announcer provided, through the small rush of finding the familiar name for something that the body had already recognized. Edith Piaf, a name that by this point was attached to enough to recordings, to a reputation that had crossed the ocean ahead of the music, to the specific kind of fame that French Chanson had achieved in certain corners of American listening, that the person could now place the voice within a context that had not existed for them on that afternoon in Paris. What they could not do in that moment was quite believe the conjunction, the voice from the street corner and the voice on the radio were the same voice. Not because the voice had changed. It had not changed in any way that a single listener, hearing both ends of a decade apart, would characterize as change. It had deepened, perhaps, in the way that all voices deepen with use and time. But the quality that had stopped them on the street in Paris was the same quality coming through the radio in a room far from Paris. And the recognition was total and physical, and for the duration of the song, almost overwhelming. What they were recognizing was not just the voice. They were recognizing the afternoon, the street, the particular light of that neighborhood in that season, which memory had preserved in a way that was more accurate than they had known. Because memory requires a hook to hang itself on, and the hook had, for a decade, been missing. The voice was the hook. With it, the afternoon came back with the specific sensory accuracy that only attached memories can produce. Not just the voice, but the temperature of the air, the distance of the sound, the way they had been walking, and then not walking, and then walking again. And with the afternoon came something else. The understanding that they had been standing in front of something they did not have the equipment to understand at the time. Not because they lacked intelligence or taste or the capacity for the experience the voice produced. They had experienced it. They had stopped, after all, had stood for the length of a song in a passage in Paris because something in the air had made stopping the only reasonable response. They had simply lacked the context, the name, the recording, the radio, the particular frame that famous things acquire around themselves, which allows subsequent listeners to hear what earlier listeners heard without knowing that was what they were hearing. They had heard Edith Piaf sing on a Paris street before the frame existed. They were hearing her now, on a radio in a room far from Paris, with the frame fully in place. And the thing that the conjunction of those two moments produced was not simply nostalgia, or not only nostalgia, though nostalgia was the word most easily available for it. It was something more specific, the retroactive understanding of a moment that had been significant without being recognizable as significant, and the particular emotion that attaches to the realization that you were once present at the beginning of something enormous and went on about your afternoon without knowing it. The song ended. The radio moved on to the next thing, as radios do. The person sat with what the last few minutes had produced in them, a mixture of recognition and loss, and something that did not have a clean name, which is the feeling that arrives when a memory that has been waiting for its meaning finally receives it. and the meaning turns out to be larger than the memory's container. Edith Piaf, on that afternoon in Paris, had been singing to the street, to the passers-by, to the indifferent city, to whoever stopped and whoever did not stop, and whoever would remember and whoever would forget. She had not known, any more than anyone else that afternoon, what the voice was at the beginning of. She was simply doing the thing she did in the streets that had taught her to do it, in the years before the world had organized itself around what she was. There is something worth pausing on in the specific shape of this kind of recognition. Most of what we know about Edith Piaf, we know from the direction that fame travels, forward, from the recordings and the concerts and the reviews and the photographs, outward into the world, accumulating context as it goes. We hear the voice already knowing what we are hearing. The frame is in place before the first note arrives. This is not a flaw in how we receive great art. It is simply the condition of receiving it after the fact, which is the condition almost all of us are in. But the person on that street corner in Paris had heard the voice without the frame. They had received it as a sound in the air on an ordinary afternoon, with no preparation and no context and no name attached. And what they had received had still been enough to stop them. This is the thing the radio moment clarified. The voice had not needed the frame. The frame came later, and the frame was useful. It gave the voice a name, a history, a place in the world that made it findable. But the voice itself had already done its work on that street corner, years before any of that existed, on a person who had nothing to bring to the listening except the fact of having ears and an afternoon that had briefly become available for something other than where they were going. Edith Piaf sang to a lot of people. She sang to thousands of people in concert halls, and to millions through recordings, and to whatever uncountable number of people heard her voice in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary day, on a radio, in a cafe, from a window across a courtyard. Most of those people heard her already knowing who she was. A very small number of people heard her before she was who she became. And of that small number, some stopped. Some stood for the length of a song on a street corner in Paris in the late 1930s, and then went on about their afternoon, carrying something they could not name. What they carried was the beginning of her. The voice before the world had organized itself around the voice, and when the radio gave it back to them, years later, across an ocean, what returned was not only the voice, it was the afternoon and the street, and the particular quality of a moment in which something enormous had been present without announcing itself, waiting, as large things sometimes do, for the world to catch up. One person had stopped. One person had carried the afternoon across an ocean and a decade without knowing what they were carrying. And on a day when the radio in a room far from Paris played a song that the world already knew, that person finally understood what they had been holding all that time, and what it had cost them nothing to receive, and everything, slowly, to fully hear.